Hello, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today we're having a distinguished guest, Elbridge Colby. Hello, Elbridge. How are you?
Hi, Jacek. Good to be with you again.
I'm sure that my viewers know who Elbridge Colby is. He is the author of a great book. We will discuss this book during the program, Strategy of Denial, a great masterpiece of strategic thought. And also during the Trump administration, one of the main architects of the national strategy, so to speak, and one of the authors, if I may put it that way, of the national military strategy of the United States and the Pentagon. So, you know, Elbridge, you're still, if I may say so, a young person, so to speak, in terms of grand strategy thinkers. So
it's an old field.
and we are sailing into uncharted waters of great power competition in Eurasia, in a triangle between Russia, US, and China, which is somewhat different from the Cold War thing. And also we have this Europe concept, European Union, whatever it called, which is still vague, and we don't know how to eat it, so to speak. So the strategic setting is different from the Cold War, and I would even contend that somewhat different from the historical examples, given the existence of nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. Also, what struck me in your book, Strategy of Denial, which I highly recommend, and I have recommended already to my viewers on many occasions during my lectures as well, and I read it the second time recently. What struck me the most was, and especially into when we have this war in Ukraine hanging on with us, is that their limited war between great powers, either by proxy or by signaling or by control of escalation, is quite possible and doable in Eurasia. Some even claim that this is scalable world war. How would you, start? Let's get started our conversation. How would you generally comment on that? How would you, react to what I have just said?
Well, thank you, my friend. It's wonderful to be with you and your viewers. Ever since I first came on, you're really insightful and lucid and rigorous show. It's been such a pleasure and your viewers as well. It really one of the premier fora for really serious strategic thinking in the world. So delighted to be back. And thank you for your kind words. It's an honor. So really appreciate that. I think you put your finger in a way that I'm not sure anybody else has, and what is really a key part of my argument, really more my framework. It's more of an analytical assessment, and I think it's one of the most important, if tragic, takeaways from the Ukraine war is actually not just the possibility of limited war, but actually quite deliberate and almost subtle management of it. And I think that has relevance. Obviously, thankfully, the war has not escalated to the nuclear level, but there have been multiple axes of escalation management on, from multiple angles. Obviously, Ukraine itself to some extent, but also Russia, has managed, say, deliberate attacks beyond the borders of Ukraine. The United States itself, President Biden on down, trying to put boundaries on escalation in terms of the use of American military equipment into Russian territory. And actually, a lot of it has been ambiguous and shifting, which is, part of the argument for why limited wars can't really happen, is that they're not fixed, and I go into this in great depth in the book. But as in Vietnam and Korea, we see that despite the fact that there are no fixed rules, it's not a treaty, it's not a formal contract, nonetheless that's happening. In fact, even more, one of the key points that I've taken away is that economic interdependence actually continues even in a war. I mean, the Ukraine and Russia, as I understand it, have continued. I mean, the grain deal is one example. I believe there's natural gas exports from Russia through Ukraine that have continued. And of course, with intermediation, but if you're looking at it from a strategic point of view, Russian-European trade and Russian-Ukrainian trade has continued. So that's very important because it dramatically, I think one of the key lessons here is really to undermine the argument that economic sanctions can have meaningful effects, certainly at the strategic choice level, but even in degrading, say, Russia's military capacity, it's had quite limited effects, even of that narrower goal, which I think is a more credible one. But it also shows that, for instance, just to kind of maybe jump ahead, but there was a Bloomberg analysis the other day, we're speaking in January, earlier in January, that posited that the Chinese would lose like 14% of their GDP if there were a war over Taiwan, but that assumed crippling, in a sense, almost suicidal sanctions by a range of G7 and other key economic actors, which is very unlikely to happen for multiple reasons, especially if the war resolves quickly in China's favor, and that you're likely to see. I mean, I don't know exact examples, but apparently Armenian and Kazakh consumption of semiconductors has shot up, in an inordinate amount in the last couple of years. So we can see what's going on. I think that is another very important piece of evidence that shows, unfortunately, that limited wars, well, fortunately and unfortunately, it's paradoxical, that limited wars under the nuclear shadow or under the shadow of mutual devastation are possible and cognizable. And now it's been decisively demonstrated in a way that I think one of the lessons for China is this is a very real possibility, unfortunately.
Yeah, we also derive many lessons from what we saw here in Poland and in Europe. One of the lessons, for example, and I would like to sort of be in a defiant mode a little bit, because I really want to draw your reaction, is that it may seem to the United States strategic establishment, that prior to the war, United States had seemed to be in an inferior position in Eurasia and in Europe towards the structural forces that were driving events. Globalization, weakening U.S. military presence, structural deficits, and all those arguments. Still, the United States managed to really brilliantly manage the situation, control escalation, and attrit Russian forces, create the anti-Russian coalition in Europe. They're cheap, by the way. They're cheap. And also laid foundations for may not yet happening, but maybe in the future, for anti-China coalition based on the resentment against those revisionist powers that really started the war, and now we have the sanction regime, and we need to rebalance our economies in Europe. So United States has scored a real strategic victory for almost no dime, and that might push the United States to think that it's really doable also vis-a-vis China. We can have this limited war by proxy, or maybe with some sort of engagement, so direct engagement, with a combination of technology regime, a sanction regime, financial regime, US dollar access, all those instruments of levers of power, and within the scalable world war, and the US establishment might start thinking about it. And even if this establishment is not thinking about it, the new establishment after the false election might start thinking about it. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I have a different perspective, and I think a couple of things. I think it's really important to root our analysis in what is most relevant in determining the geopolitics and the strategic outcomes, because this is critical. And this is actually the debate, for instance, that Jake Sullivan wrote something in Foreign Policy a couple of years ago that was critical of my analysis about this precise topic. I think this is really important. And this goes to something I was just saying, which is that economic sanctions don't really work, right? And they certainly, I think, are even less likely to work against China than they are against Russia. So so let's give the best argument, as you put it, Jacek, you often hear from American foreign policy establishment types, is, well, the United States has degraded the Russian military for a song. It's consolidated Europe on its behalf, so Europe's weight will be added to the anti-hegemonic or whatever China coalition. The problem with that is that what Europe has to offer is not valuable in a material way for the anti-hegemonic coalition vis-a-vis China, because Europe doesn't have military forces that are relevant to the decisive theater, as I go into my book, which is along the First Island chain in the Western Pacific, for reasons I think we've talked about in the past, but happy to elaborate on. Secondly, economic sanctions don't really work. And especially once a resolute leader like Xi Jinping has initiated, that has semi-totalitarian instruments of political control, economic sanctions are not very effective. And you can see that in Russia right now. I mean, the Russian consumer is suffering, but that doesn't really provide benefit in terms of, they're clearly not working at a strategic perspective at all. They're not, I don't think, in any way shaping Russian strategic decision-making in ways favorable to us. We can make an argument about whether degrading Russia's military capacity over time. I think the argument even there is tough to make. But then the third point, which is the point I always kind of go back to Macron actually doing us a favor, which is that I think it's very unlikely that the Europeans would mount the kind of economically suicidal sanctions that the Bloomberg analysis assumes for that, right? Why? Well, the European economies were not doing great before 2022, but now they're doing even worse because of decoupling from Russia and the consequences of the war. So the war has actually undermined. So there's this argument that the U.S. is so brilliant, it's made Europe more dependent. Actually, that's a bad thing for us, because we don't want a more dependent Europe, because what they have to offer us vis-a-vis China is not that valuable. And then there's a sucking vacuum sound in Europe against the rival that even before 2022 we understood was a distant second at best. So the U.S. has spent well over $100 billion. There's $60 billion more on the table for Ukraine. Money is not fungible. Money is not, the spigot is running out because people are feeling like interest rates are going up and people feeling like there's too much spending. Of course, weapons that we've given to the Ukrainians, not all of which are crossover, but many of which are crossover, are very difficult to replace. Then, even worse, in my view, I don't think it can be taken as a given that the Russians have been degraded as a military threat over time. Their military, the military as it existed in 2022 has been substantially attrited. Now, I'm a little skeptical of some of the claims from the U.S. government about the degree of attrition, but order of magnitude, that sounds right. There's been huge numbers of losses for the Russian military, both in personnel and in equipment. However, the degree of military, look at the United States at the beginning of World War II, the degree of investment by a society and an economy in the military is not a fixed variable. Russia is militarizing its society. Again, the suffering party is the Russian consumer, but that doesn't do anything for us. And over time, I actually agree with Poland, the Baltic states, and many others. Bauer, Rasmussen have said that in this part, I agree. Russia will be a threat, especially to Eastern NATO. They are even more hostile to the West and aligned with China. And of course, now they're a dependent partner to China, and can create problems if we do not have the strategic focus that we need. So I actually think, even in this sense of attriting the Russian military, I think our situation now is very bad. And now we're about to start a war, it seems like, potentially, which is kind of mind-boggling, with the Houthis, who it's hard to imagine a less strategically significant country than Yemen. And we're about to start a war there, expending precious ammunition, munitions, political will, without any conception of a theory of victory. The President of the United States said, we're going to bomb them, but we don't think it's going to stop. I mean, it would be parodic if it were not so serious and tragic at the same time.
Yeah, and that brings us to a major question that I always wanted to ask you and have a major debate with you as a great strategic thinker that you showed in your book, Strategy of Denial. Biden demonstrated in his speech over the Gaza thing that the United States has stuck to the strategy of primacy in Eurasia, in the world, primacy.
Right. Without the resource investment.
Without resources. The question number one, don't you think that Eurasian powers are happy about it? Because if there is a gap between declarations and capabilities, it's a major testing area. You can be tested, and you are tested in the faraway regions where your power is not reaching, and then your credibility is gone. So this is number one. So my question is whether primacy is achievable. I mean, achievable by the U.S. And in the same sense, whether it's in the U.S. interest to keep on primacy strategy. Why maybe the U.S. interests are better served by offshore balancing or selective engagement that I understand you have proposed towards China. But let's say offshore balancing, and it's more about interests.
Right.
And a fair conversation with the allies in Eurasia that it's the time of the offshore balancing because it's good enough for the stability, and you need to reckon with the new reality and take on responsibility and have a new realignment of alliances and interests and a new equilibrium that will give us peace, because otherwise this is a recipe for a war. What do you think about this?
Well, excellent question. Primacy, if we pursue it, we court disaster. And we are pursuing it now without even notionally investing the resources necessary. So I think our foreign policy now is actually, and I use this word advisedly, I'm not trying to be dramatic, is verging on the catastrophic. I mean, if you were a business and you had multiple lines of business out and you were in debt, that's just essentially, we're in strategic debt, and you're just waiting to get called. You're waiting to have a run on the bank, on the company or whatever, and you can't pay your debts. That's where we are. And that's why I bring up the Yemen thing. I mean, it's almost surreal that we would have the strategic indiscipline to get sucked into yet another, I mean, really almost risible, again, if it weren't so serious. I mean, really, I don't know what comes after tertiary. I think it's quad in Latin, so it's something along that, but it's really surreal. Let me break this down. So first, I think there's an abstract intellectual question of whether primacy is desirable. And there was a debate between Sam Huntington and Bob Jervis in the 90s. That was an interesting and important debate in the 1990s and into the 2000s. Personally, I don't think primacy is really desirable in some abstract sense, or it's not obligatorily necessary. I was always sort of a more restrainer oriented in those years, because I thought, we don't need, Robert Kagan being the most well-known probably exponent of that view of, the global liberal hegemon fighting back the jungle. Nobody fights back the jungle, right? Like, you got to have a little bit more. You can't get in futile wars, et cetera. But here's the point. Here's the key point is that, as they say in the law, that issue is not even reached because primacy is definitely not feasible. And this is where the problem is in Washington and with President Biden, but also many Republican leaders from an earlier generation, is they just haven't, apparently they're not grappling. And it's very paradoxical because the very people who've been saying for like half a generation that we haven't been spending enough on defense are now saying that we should act as a global hegemon, despite the rise of China. They all, put themselves out as China hawks, but it just doesn't add up, right? And so whether or not it's desirable, we could have a debate about, but it's kind of not worth it. The issue is feasibility because, well, China's now roughly, if you use purchasing power parity, it's a larger economy. If you use market exchange terms, not quite, but it's order of magnitude. And then you add Russia, Iran, North Korea, of course, and then you see the difficulties that we've had in using military force to impose our will. So, global primacy is just not tenable. We cannot do it alone. Or anything close to, with the kind of the Brits and the Aussies in tow. That model isn't going to work anymore. And I just think that is that's why I keep hammering on scarcity, because if we can get people to accept that point, then we can have a much more productive conversation about relative strategies and trade-offs. But I think that to me is sort of a non-negotiable. It's almost, I don't think it's serious to say that we can do that. For instance, some people, including friends of mine, are out there arguing. I mean, even if we leave aside, let's say the American economy was humming along and we had a balanced budget like we did in 2000, which we don't. Even then, primacy would be untenable, I think. But you could have a better argument for it. But we don't have that situation. Instead, we have historic deficits. I mean, Jamie Dimon, hardly an outsider voice, was saying this at Davos, saying deficits are out of control. Spending is out of control. Even the Wall Street Journal op-ed page is running articles by the former head of the Bush, I think it was the Council of Economic Advisors, saying we can't afford to borrow or raise taxes. Ergo, so then there's people out there, the primacy types, a lot of people in this sort of so-called establishment are saying we should double defense spending. There is zero chance of that happening in the current political climate. And the evidence, you don't need to take it from me, just look at what's happening on the Hill and the fact of where the budget negotiations are. And by the way, couple that with all the articles that have come out and are now in the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, et cetera, about the limits to our defense industrial base. So we can't do that.
Is it hubris, Elbridge? It's critically important. Is it hubris? Listen, during the Second World War, those Germans guys and those imperial Japanese guys were weaklings compared to China and Russia these days. Major raw materials producer, major crop producer, I mean the biggest one, the main manufacturing base, neighboring to each other, nightmare of Mackinder within Eurasia. That can,
I think it is hubris
on Greenland.
I think it's hubris. I think hubris is the core, and there is like a hubris, and there's like a nemesis element. And I actually, it was funny. I was talking to another Polish friend a little while ago who was talking about his family member coming to the United States and saying to herself, like, this is a country that has never been bombed. And there maybe is like a lacking sense of the tragic. I mean, the South here in this country traditionally had something of a sense of that. But I think it's a grave failure of responsibility, because even after Vietnam, Americans had, and Vietnam was much less costly for the United States than, say, World War II was for Poland or the Soviet Union or Germany. So it's not even in that. How could we have forgotten some of these lessons in living memory? And that's something I really struggle with, because my whole project is to try to bring us to grapple with reality, because then once you're grappling with reality, you can have a debate among strategists that are about serious trade-offs. But I don't know. I think in the back of their mind, if I'm giving them the best argument, some of them think the Chinese will, maybe they've overlearned the Soviet Union lesson. They think that it's a paper tiger at the end of the day, and that it won't go so far, which I think is just a really imprudent assumption. I mean, let's be honest. If you go to the Chinese Military Museum in Beijing, they believe they won the Korean War the last time we fought them. I mean, which objectively, from their entry into the war, they pushed us back. They made progress. So who are we to have this hubris? And I mean, and the Ukraine war, the euphoria that accompanied the Ukrainians' very noble and commendable heroic resistance and progress in the offensives in late 2022 kind of powered this almost magical thinking element that exists in American strategic thought, maybe in Europe too. So that's a real problem. Let me answer your last question, which is about offshore balancing. I'm not an offshore balancer or an onshore balancer. I'm a don't let anyone dominate the key region of the world in particular person. And I think that may demand different strategies based on the correlation of forces and military buildup. I wouldn't consider myself an offshore balancer in the case of Asia, because I'm much more concerned that a coalition would fall apart if China was successful in a regional war against the United States. Whereas the kind of core view of the more sanguine offshore balancers is, if the Chinese push, the Japanese will rearm, South Korea will rearm. And I just thinking as a realist, I think to myself, well, you want your freedom and autonomy, but you really don't want to be destroyed in a futile effort. There are only so many people who are going to do kamikazes. And contemporary Japan, I don't think, is going to do that kind of thing. So
maybe there is a difference because of geography also, and the structure of alliance. I think in Europe, the US has really a strategic depth in the western part of Europe, and many allies with GDPs and stuff. So there is a balancing coalition against Russia that is much earlier to mature than in Asia, where the preponderance of China is much bigger, and geography is more demanding for the US, because nobody will enter the war without the US as a maritime power in defense of Taiwan, because Taiwan has to be defended from sea. So that change, I think this changes the calculation. Here in Europe, the US escalation control management much better because of the sanctuaries, NATO sanctuaries in Poland, Romania,
exactly,
being frightened to escalate because of this and that and so on, and the land warfare, which is more attriting, while in the Western Pacific, US has to step in quickly, because otherwise the money's full.
I think China is a central power, like literally from a geography, as you right, and it's already. I was talking to somebody the other day. They said, "Oh, is the 𝗲𝗏𝗃 gap the new inter-German border?" And I said, it said like, is this a new 𝗲𝗏𝗃? And I said, no, China is more like the inter-German border. They are already they're already like close to the Rhine. If we think 1980, and they're a central power, and they can decide where to go, like Germany in the old days, but they're much, much larger relative to their neighbors than Germany ever was. And so if they break through in the first island chain, there's no strategic depth. There's Truk and Kwajalein and Guam. These are tiny islands, very, relatively speaking, economically primitive, etc. So the strategic weight in Asia that's not China is all around their periphery. So we have very limited strategic depth. Meantime, in Europe, the war that's happening, a very tragic war and an evil attack by Putin, is happening at the extremity of historical conceptions of whatever Europe is. So there's like layers of strategic depth, including, of course, Poland, to its great credit, as a forward defense. But, so there, I'm much more sympathetic to offshore balancing. I mean, offshore balancing is one of those terms I don't want to have to carry all the baggage that other people are using. But a lighter U.S. role is much more consistent and much more strategically feasible than it is in Asia. And I don't believe, people are saying, oh, if the United States does what you're saying, Bridge, then what? Then Poland's going to surrender to Russia? Lithuania is going to surrender to Russia? No. The Western Europeans are demonstrating that they are free riding on the Eastern Europeans, and to some extent the Americans. Yeah. But that, of course, just supports my analysis that there's a lot of, Macron was going the other day and saying, oh my gosh, and Ukraine, and what's going to happen in America? And meantime, the French have barely given the Ukrainians anything. So,
because Elbridge, I think the U.S. strategists already realized that, it is true that in Eastern Europe there is no appetite for bandwagoning at all, right? Or any even sort of the anything to do with coming to terms with the new reality. So we would be fighting. So it's, on one hand, it's easier for the United States to create anti-Russian coalition without basically paying for it almost, yeah? So, which is a good thing for the US. On the other hand, there is a preoccupation in Poland that, okay, if we are to field a major land force, we need to have some freedom of action, so to speak. We call it the protocol of proportionality,
But I agree with that.
That, you need to give us free hand, and sometimes we need to act preemptively. And that, of course, collides with Article 5, NATO, this political umbrella, and the U.S. escalation control.
But that's my view, like on the Ukraine war, is, Aris Racinas kind of lumped me in a piece he wrote today as like I was being hypocritical, being more supportive of the Israelis than of Ukraine. And I said, I wrote on Twitter, I don't think that's true, because I'm basically, it's the same model for Europe, the Israelis, and the Indians, which are the secondary theaters, or tertiary theaters, which is, you do more. In exchange, we will help you wherever we can, consistent with our focus on the first island chain, and we will give you more discretion, especially the countries that step up. So my view is, preemption, starting a war, that's a big issue. Okay, let's just, but political strategy, orientation of Washington in terms of local partners and who we prioritize. To me, Poland should be at the top. Well, Poland's pulling its weight. It's saying, well, what do the Poles think? Oh, and then we'll get to Berlin way down the list. And I'm not just saying this because you're Polish. I say this to the Germans. It's because, well, these are the people who we want to incentivize this behavior. And we are not going to do what the Israelis call the bear hug. Like, my view is, if the Israelis want to take action, they need to understand that the Americans are going to be very restrained in terms of getting involved into a large Middle Eastern war, of course, and also that there's only so much we can do from a support point of view at this time, given the defense industrial base. But with that all said, with that new model, if you have a different approach and you feel you need to be more aggressive, same with the Indians, Pakistan, or something like that, that is the model to me.
Yeah, but at Strategy&Future, we fully understand. But of course, you know how it unnerves people that are attached to this NATO political umbrella, that, we are the primacy mode, and we need to listen to this, plus also, I think those protagonists of the primacy in the US don't like, losing control of the escalation management. So this is, the same people that are in favor of primacy, they also want to control escalation. So
exactly,
all those resources, policy, 24 hours, it doesn't match altogether, so to speak.
Exactly. No, I agree. I think that is trying to think of a word that's not too over the top, but that is the suboptimal alignment of, like, people in Europe who are comfortable with the sort of, you basically pay psychic taxes to the American elite.
Yeah.
And instead, and you play a certain role, you're @𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 or whatever, you're some like European type who's got like, you go to Davos and Munich and blah, blah, blah. And then but the Americans are up there, but you're very close with them and you know how to kind of work with them. And then the American elite benefits because they're like, they get to be the elite. That's pretty cool, right? And you get this like, but it doesn't work. Like, I was never a huge fan of it even back in the day, but it was a tenable position, a highly tenable position 20 years ago. But it's just not workable anymore. And that's, and they have just from a kind of sociological point of view, part of what I think people like us are hopefully trying to do is just like the emperor has no clothes, and there needs to be a reform. I mean, you always have to have an elite. You always have to have an establishment, et cetera. There are even elites in Maoist China, right? That's not, but like this one is driving us towards the iceberg because they're so wedded to the old model.
True. There is also another aspect of what we're discussing is that, that it's also ambiguous for the United States, depending on the time period, for example. I think that the Western European elites, France and Germany, and foremost, realized that what we're discussing is happening, or at least it might be happening in the American mindset. Right. So in Poland, we suspect that this push for, creating one union, one European Union, and now one state, is an attempt to divert Poles from thinking independently about fielding a force and not negotiating and taking on Russians on our own terms, having in our back the proportionality agreement with the US, and modernizing our military. Because they want to negotiate with the French and the Germans want to negotiate over our heads with the Russians, having in mind that the Americans are there in the Pacific. They don't give it, they don't give a damn. Pardon my French. So what I'm just saying is not to advocate the Poles, Poland and so on, but I recalled recently that NATO was created, and also push for the European Union was sort of enhanced by the US to create the proper balance of power that favors US interests in Europe. I wonder what is the definition of favorable balance of power for the US interests?
No. So here's the key thing, and great question. I mean, my view, again, with the idea of deferring more and not being, superimposing kind of Madeleine Albright style or George W. like our will on you, is like, well, what is it that the Europeans determine is the best way forward? We should, if that's the European, I mean, I have my own views as an American about the European Union, but that's not the point. The point is the strategic alignment. But on the other hand, if maybe it's more an alignment, sort of a confederation of more vigorous states like Poland. Now, couple points. One, until that, that's never going to be finalized, presumably, like it's going to be an ongoing political dynamic. Until that point, I'm going to be inclined to say, well, who are the ones who are actually putting their money where their mouth is? Oh, Poland is. Okay, we'll listen to Poland. Okay, France, a lot of talk, less follow through, So, okay, I hear what the Poles are saying. I hear the Finns are doing a lot of stuff. Romania is doing a little bit more. Germany, way behind. Britain, a lot of talk, less action, less investment. Okay, like that's kind of how we're going to orient. And my view is we should be open-minded to what exactly that arrangement is. Because the only thing, the United States' basic interest is in avoiding a hegemon, by the way, including potentially European Union. I go into this in my book.
Yeah, I know. That's what I can.
So if anything, we have an interest more in significant states that we can kind of make deals with and so forth. But again, the primary problem is in Asia, so we should be willing to be flexible on that issue. But I would also say the paradox of the Western position, like the French in particular, and I've talked to them about this a lot, is they actually need the Americans to be in Europe enough to like reassure Poland and others, because nobody in Poland obviously trusts the French. So like the French should actually be hugging the Americans closely, actually going along with what I'm saying, and try, even if they plan to stab us in the back later, trying to get. But instead, Macron is always presenting this as an alternative, which of course alienates us. But then he also is alien. So unfortunately, realistically, my sense is that you're not going to get some very cohesive European agenda in the coming years. There's going to be differences. So we're going to have to make the best of it, and that means working with countries like Poland, again, Finland, et cetera, that are serious about the problem.
Yeah, this is what it looks like. There is this sort of re-anchoring with the US on part of Finland and Sweden and Norway. In Poland, this is a default setting in Poland, because we don't trust the continental powers historically, by the way.
I mean, not without reason.
Yeah, so we always tend to cling on to sea powers. So it's an easy game for US. So to sort of have this sort of the arrangement with us. But it seems that the main axis of Europe, being France and Germany, are having a different agenda, and I wonder how the US is going to play the game. I mean, especially that they suspect that you really want to pivot away to Asia, to the Asian Pacific, and this is why I saw many American strategists having a dispute with you over your book, over your argument that you need to focus on Asia Pacific, that the empires, they claim that the empires don't withdraw, they sort of this argument that once you engage selectively, you're gone. Yeah,
the one who wants to
let me navigate through that.
Like, if you want to collapse the system, act like there's no problem. It's like I just like actually some of the American response. I mean, that's why it's so refreshing to talk to you, because I mean, so much of the response to my book is just like honestly borderline delusional. I mean, like that we're gonna just bluff our way through the problem, and I think we've seen, unfortunately, in the last few years, that things are getting worse, and they're probably going to get even worse than they are now. They very well could. And the notion that empires can't reassess is like demonstrably wrong.
Yeah,
Great Britain had a major empire after it lost the 13 colonies of America, right?
Yeah.
Like, we won the Cold War after the war.
I also read your article about deprioritization. Yeah, I think this was about it. With Wes Mitchell and
you got it like a business. You cut bad lines if you don't want to necessarily, but you gotta. It's a competitive market, and if you want to actually save your company, you have to reduce your threat surface. And so that's, I mean, if you really want to save the system, and I actually haven't seen. I mean, I don't think I'm saying anything about my partner Wes Mitchell, who has his own views, and I don't speak for him or anything. But like, he's always like, I haven't seen somebody really undermine or get the better of you on the basic facts. I mean, you mentioned the Sino-Russian axis versus the Western or the Allied powers. The Chinese, this is according to our own Office of National Intelligence, Naval Intelligence, has 200 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States.
Yeah, that's really creepy.
Yeah, and like, people are saying, oh, Xi Jinping's done, he's finished, he's firing his generals, they're having economic headwinds. What are they talking about? I mean, look, anything's possible. It is possible that the Chinese economy will fall apart, that Xi Jinping's successor will be more like Mikhail Gorbachev, despite the fact that Xi Jinping has arranged the whole system to avoid the emergence of Mikhail Gorbachev, that the Chinese military turns out to be a joke, etc. But you don't bet the farm on it. You don't bet your society. By the way, we never fought the Red Army, thank God.
Yeah.
I personally think they would have been a lot more formidable than the Iraqis. Thank God we never fought them. And for Americans, one thing just drives me nuts is like, look, I had family in the European theater of operations, not like, I mean, if anything, but the notion, there's this idea that the Americans are this military hegemon of like unchallenged. And it's like, I mean, have people examined the record and how much of the Americans experienced in terms of, thank God, our experience of great power war, or even these peripheral wars, which was fatal for 58,000 Americans, tragically, not to mention a lot of Vietnamese. There's almost like this, I don't know, maybe this is why I get along with Paul so much. Like, there's a lack of historical sort of a tragic sense, not tragic in the sense that everything's futile, but just like how grave this thing could be. Whereas I think, unfortunately, our opponents, Xi Jinping, definitely has a kind of sensibility like this, but is determined nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, I think the American audience that will watch us should remember that the Second World War, you were fighting along with your allies in Chinese and the Soviets that were fighting the Japan, and they were having the burden, the most burden. They were doing this war.
Can I just say on this point? Sorry to interrupt, but I touched on this about. It was actually after Pope Benedict passed away. I'm Catholic, and I wrote something about. He had given a speech at D-Day about how it showed that pacifism, pure pacifism, is untenable because the truly evil state needed to be defeated by military force. And I just made the point on top of that actually even more, we needed what was actually an evil empire, Soviet Union. I think it was an evil empire, to do most of the fighting. They did 80% of German casualties were on the Eastern Front, and of course Paul doesn't want to hear it, but that's the reality.
Yes, that's true.
And it got a lot of criticism, like from the sort of, NAFO brigade, if you'll forgive it. And it was actually like I put my finger on some surrealist, magical thinking, like wait, you think that the Americans, by the time the Soviets were already in Poland, by the time the Americans landed, and by the way, the British and the Canadians landed D-Day, like, who are we kidding? Thank God. I wouldn't be here if we landed earlier. I don't think.
Plus, the Chinese Kuomintang also was handling the Japanese,
the entire Japanese army, basically, almost. Yeah.
So that's true. And just also on top of that, and continuing this conversation about the very realistic, even cynical aspect of foreign policy. I was doing a simulation of Strategy and Future with my friends a month ago, where there was this, when we introduced the offshore balancing on the part of the United States by the new president, whoever is going to be the new president, and there was this feeling, first of all, that the U.S. interests were better served. You had more maneuvering, sort of. You could reestablish your military properly, but also, you know what? That created among the Chinese leadership the fear and suspicion that this move by the United States of offshore balancing has yielded some pressure on Russia, which, in turn made the Russians realize that they are dependent upon Chinese increasingly, and that became their threat acute number one now, not pressure from the United States and European Peninsula, and they need to do something about it. So the Chinese stopped trusting the Russians as allies, and that created this pressure. And on the other hand, the Russians started feeling it, and that created the first that there might be a reverse Nixon thing.
I mean, I'm like, reverse Nixon 5 years ago was, I think, a attractive strategy, but today, you may be right. I'm not saying you're wrong, but I don't think we can bet on it. I mean, I think that the alienation and hostility is so deep, particularly with Putin. But in the future, it does seem like a Russia that is essentially so dependent on China, and of course, the incentives for abusing that position are so great on the part of China. And there's I don't want to generalize, but you have seen out of the Chinese system an arrogance and a kind of high-handedness that eventually I would expect to grate on the Russians. But the question is relative threat perception, right? But yeah, I mean, I tend to look at it more purely from the kind of military balance. I mean, if we had, it would be great if we could build a military that could fight two wars that was optimized at a relatively sane level of spending, say, comparable to what we spend as a proportion of GDP today, that fit in with allied forces, particularly in Europe, like Poland's, that were more, ground-centric and tactical aviation. But that's not where we are, and it'd take a very long time to do it. And that's actually not the military we're developing, partially because of organizational interests and so forth.
Yeah, but can the United States afford it? Both, not only two wars, but even in one major war and a second minor war, containing Russia. Looking at looking from Eurasia, we're every day looking at your structural deficit. At the age of baby boomers who are retiring now, and you have the economy booming, and still you have this structural deficit, and so, and the industrial base and so on. So it doesn't look good. So your treasuries don't sell that well.
Right. No, I agree with you. And one of the things one of the indictments of the current establishment that I mentioned earlier is these people calling for a doubling of defense spending or whatever, dramatic increases in defense spending, as if that is a credible solution, certainly before a war. And I see essentially no interest. And if anything, I put a tweet out earlier in January, about, you look at the political dynamic. They're huge. What McCarthy and what Speaker Johnson now is potentially at risk of on the motion to vacate, I don't know what's going to happen, but at least it's a material risk, is too much spending. And of course, the Republicans are notionally for higher defense spending, but it's not like changing the curve. And it's also, over half of defense spending is in personnel costs, I believe, where we have an all-volunteer force. There's huge, overly expensive stuff in our defense industrial base because of consolidation and so forth. So a lot of that it's not wasted per se, but it's like, it's not efficient spending, unlike, say, the Chinese and the Russians. And then both President Trump and President Biden have said Social Security cuts are off the table. In fact, it's a major issue even in the Republican primary. And I mean, like, the part of the problem is, I think a lot of the European, not so much you, but like other Europeans, are kind of listening to these sort of standard foreign policy people for whom it's easy to say, oh, you should cut Social Security and increase defense spending. No politician, or certainly, I mean, there are politicians, but no majority is going to get elected and reelected on that right now, as far as I can tell. I mean, as like the Wall Street Journal op-ed page will argue for it, but and whether it's Social Security and Medicare or the whole entitlement system, when we're already spending 3.5% or 3 to 3.5% of GDP on defense. So I think we're not likely to get significant increases. The best that I'm arguing for, that I think is politically credible, is a defense industrial base reboot as part of reindustrialization, where I could see people saying, yeah, I'm not just giving money to Lockheed and Raytheon and their shareholders. We're bringing back hard hat, blue collar jobs that don't require a college degree or maybe a 2-year degree. And that's kind of consistent with the trends socially and politically, that then you could actually have a better defense industrial base. That is one of the things, and I could see a coalition coming together, whether that would be officially defense spending or not. But that's going to take longer, and that's not necessarily more people in uniform. That's more like more factories.
It's like Sputnik moment and Eisenhower reforms.
Yeah.
Yeah. I understand.
By the way, about Eisenhower, remember, you were mentioning about NATO. Eisenhower himself, if you go back and you read Mark Trachtenberg's book, Constructed Peace, the idea of NATO was never to have the Europeans be dependents. I mean, Eisenhower himself was like, he thought that if we had ground troops in Europe after a certain point, it was a failure. He was actually, I mean, Kennedy kind of changed that. But throughout the Cold War, we need a Cold War mindset. We need, like, hey, everybody pays their due. The Americans can't get too much. What we need to get rid of, and I try to stress this point, is the post-Cold War mindset. The kind of, we can't call our global liberal hegemon Robert Kagan, Carl Bildt, Madeleine Albright. That is what we need to dispense with.
Yeah, and I'm having the last question. We're going towards the end of our conversation, and this is a sensitive one. So I understand if you sort of it will be difficult to answer. We're having this primacy. Yeah, the United States has, since the inception of the nuclear weapons, been always hesitant to and against proliferation. But now, right now, we're having two anti-US, anti-war allies, Russia and China. China expanding its nuclear capabilities, which creates a triangle, a very unstable thing, and we have this remnant forward basing of US maritime hegemon. So it seems not technically, not politically, bad idea. If you want to stop someone from projecting power into you, like China projecting power into Taiwan or to Japan or to Korea, if they have nuclear weapons, you can't project power into this country, right? So there are some voices in Eurasia saying that there might be a legitimate idea for the United States, if it withdraws or doing offshore balancing, to make some deals with some allies. Maybe Germany, maybe Poland, but I don't want to advocate it. Okay, it's a sensitive subject. Australia. Some people accuse already the AUKUS that Australia is going to have nuclear weapons because of that. That maybe that would create equilibrium if those allies closely aligned with the US have nuclear weapons. And of course, I know, I have known the subject matters and the books. I know how anti that thinking Americans are in strategic community, but there are some voices in Eurasia, and I just wanted to let you know that this might be.
Well, look, I think the world is better off if we limit proliferation. But as I wrote 10 years ago, and I wrote at the very end of my book, actually, is geopolitics and our interest in avoiding regional hegemons, hostile regional hegemons, is greater than non-proliferation. And I think that, you didn't even mention the problem that's at the core of it, which is, I mean, implicitly you mentioned it, obviously, which is that, and I raise this issue with the Koreans a lot. I think the Koreans have a very more legitimate, a very compelling point, because it's not in America's interest to sacrifice multiple cities to stop North Korea from doing something on the peninsula. I mean, that's just obvious, right?
The stakes of risk are different. Yeah.
I mean, it's just not, because, and you'll appreciate this, I think someone like me can make an argument for risking significant devastation, God forbid, but to avoid a superpower like China, or in the old days, the United States, dominating Asia, and in those days Europe, and thus the world. That is a rational argument, at least from a probabilistic point of view.
Yeah.
The notion that whatever North Korea does to South Korea, or even Japan, is enough to, like, when we think about it, lose Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco. No, I mean, it's facially absurd. Okay, so preventive war, bad idea, doesn't really work, etc. Okay, if we can limit them, that's why I support diplomacy with North Korea, for instance. But otherwise, everything has to be on the table, and nuclear sharing is not a solution, because nuclear sharing is still American control. And so I think that logic, we need to address this with the seriousness. If you go back, you look at what President Eisenhower's position was, or President Nixon, Jim Schlesinger. I think these are things that need to be on the table, and we need to treat them with respect. And what I'll say is, the instinctive, sort of unipolar moment, American allies getting proliferation is the worst thing and it's like, well, wait, aren't they our allies? Like, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but I mean, are we gonna, and if we know the American people are not going to dramatically increase defense spending, give me a better alternative than just bluffing. I mean, I guess, like the South, we could just keep bluffing, like the Washington Declaration is a bluff, I think, but I don't think we can impose that, and I don't think it's, by the way, the official position of the Atlantic Alliance is that the independent nuclear deterrence, the United Kingdom and France, contribute to the security of the alliance. India has nuclear weapons, etc. So, I think we need to look at this from a strategic point of view, based on what our interests ultimately are, recognizing that proliferation is a very serious danger and a very grave one, but that we are in a world of very, very grave dangers.
Yes.
And so we need to be grappling with them intelligently and realistically.
Yes. That also contributes to your concept of limited war and deterrence by, signaling capabilities in that respect. And we can navigate through this in the nuclear era, through this uncharted waters of this non-equilibrium system that is right now with us. Yeah. Okay, that's been a splendid discussion with you, as always, Elbridge.
Wonderful to see you. Thank you. Always a pleasure, Jacek.
Food for thought, as always. Looking forward to next books of yours and your actions. I really read whatever you write.
Well, thank you, my friend. Really an honor, and we should probably talk again soon, because I think our thinking is going to be more and more relevant. So.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you very much.
All right, safe travels. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.